the car belonging to the sister of Savannah Guthrie, Annie Guthrie, was towed, impounded, and taken into evidence. And that, and this is the wording, it's very important. The wording is very important. He said, they now believe the son-in-law may be the prime suspect. Those are the words. Son-in-law may be the prime suspect at this.
For a long time, the silence felt intentional, not just quiet, but controlled, like something held back on purpose. And in cases like this, silence doesn't exist without meaning. It builds tension, it creates questions, it becomes part of the story itself. And that's exactly what happened here. Because from the very beginning, the son-in-law was there, present in the background of everything, connected to the timeline, connected to the people, connected to the moments that mattered. And yet, for so long, he said nothing. Or at least nothing that moved the case forward in a way that could be clearly understood. And that silence became its own narrative, a space where people began to wonder, to question, to analyze every detail surrounding it. Because when someone who is close to the center of a case chooses not to speak, it doesn't just leave a gap, it creates one. And that gap begins to pull everything else toward it. Every unanswered question, every inconsistency, every moment that didn't fully align, all of it starts to orbit around that silence. And now, that silence is gone. Or at least it has been broken in a way that changes everything, because according to what is now emerging, the son-in-law has finally spoken to authorities. And the moment he did, the structure of the case shifted, not dramatically at first, not in a way that immediately revealed everything, but in a way that began to move the focus, to redirect attention, to create a new center of gravity within the investigation. And that's what makes this moment so important. Because when someone who has remained quiet for so long finally speaks, it's never just about what they say. It's about when they say it, why they say it, and how it fits into everything that came before. And those questions are what investigators begin to focus on immediately, not just the content of the statement, but the context surrounding it. Because context is what gives meaning to information, it's what allows a detail to be placed within the larger sequence of events. And once that placement is made, once the statement is positioned within the timeline, it begins to interact with everything else. It begins to connect, to align, or in some cases, to challenge what was previously understood. And that's where the analysis begins, not at the surface, but beneath it, where patterns start to form and connections begin to reveal themselves. And before we go deeper into what was said and how it may reshape this entire case, I want to take a moment to welcome you to the channel. We look for the truth in the shadows of cold cases and closed files. If you value this kind of deep dive investigation, please consider subscribing. And as we begin this journey together, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, whether you're joining us from the United States, Canada, Australia, or anywhere else in the world. Leave a comment below. It helps us remember that these stories, though local, touch hearts across the globe. And now as we return to this moment, the focus sharpens, because the act of speaking, especially after a long period of silence, is not random. It reflects a shift, a change in circumstances, a point where something has moved enough to prompt a response, and that response, whatever form it takes, becomes part of the investigation. Not as a conclusion, but as a piece of the puzzle that must be examined in relation to everything else. And that's exactly what is happening now. Because the son-in-law's statement is not being viewed in isolation, it is being placed within the timeline, within the sequence of events that have defined this case from the beginning. And once it is placed there, once it is aligned with the moments that have already been established, something begins to happen. Certain details start to stand out. Not because they are new, but because they now have context. They now have a reference point that allows them to be understood differently. And that's what turns a statement into a turning point. Not the fact that it exists, but the way it changes how everything else is seen. And early indications suggest that what was said may have introduced a perspective that was not fully considered before. Not entirely new, but different enough to shift how certain parts of the timeline are interpreted. And that shift is what investigators are focusing on now, because it has the potential to bring clarity to moments that have remained uncertain, to connect details that have felt disconnected, and to provide a structure that allows the case to move forward in a more defined direction. And as that process unfolds, as each part of the statement is examined and placed within the larger framework of the case, something else becomes clear. The importance of consistency, because consistency is what determines whether a statement holds under scrutiny, whether it aligns with the known facts, whether it fits within the established sequence, and that consistency is what investigators are testing now, comparing what was said with what is known to see if they match, and if they do, if the statement reinforces the existing structure, then it becomes a key piece of the puzzle, something that strengthens the case and moves it closer to resolution. But if it doesn't, if there are inconsistencies, if there are elements that don't fully align, then those become points of interest as well, places where further questions can be directed, where deeper analysis can take place. And that's what makes this moment so complex, because it is not just about receiving information, it is about interpreting it, about understanding how it fits within the larger narrative, and about determining what it reveals about the sequence of events that led to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. And that sequence is what investigators are working to reconstruct, not from a single statement, but from the accumulation of details that, when placed together, form a pattern that can be followed. And that pattern is what will ultimately reveal the truth. Because once the sequence is clear, once the connections are understood, the case moves from uncertainty to clarity, from speculation to something much more grounded, and that's where this is heading now. Toward that point where everything begins to align, where the statement that has just been introduced becomes part of a structure that holds together under scrutiny. And as we continue to follow this, to examine each detail and how it connects to the next, we move closer to that moment where the story of what happened to Nancy Guthrie can finally be understood in full. Not as fragments, not as disconnected moments, but as a complete sequence that explains how everything unfolded. And that is the moment we are moving toward now. Guided by this new development, this break in silence that may have changed everything, and as we begin to look closer at what was said, at how it was delivered, and at how it fits within the timeline, the case begins to take on a new shape, one that feels more defined, more structured, and more capable of leading to answers that have remained just out of reach until now. And if this continues, if the statement holds under scrutiny and aligns with the patterns that have already been observed, then this may be the turning point that finally brings everything together. And the moment where the case moves forward with clarity, and the truth, piece by piece, begins to reveal itself in a way that cannot be ignored. And once that statement is placed within the timeline, once investigators begin aligning it with everything that has already been established, the real work begins. Because a statement on its own is never enough. It has to be tested. It has to be measured against the sequence, against the behavior, against the details that have been gathered over time, and that's where the focus shifts from what was said to how it fits. Because if it fits cleanly, if it aligns with the known moments without forcing the timeline to bend, then it becomes something significant, something that strengthens the structure of the case. But if it doesn't, if there are slight misalignments, if there are moments where the sequence feels off, then those become points of interest, not necessarily contradictions, but places where deeper analysis is required. And that's exactly what investigators are doing now, examining each part of the son-in-law's statement in relation to the events that have already been mapped out, looking for alignment, looking for consistency, looking for the subtle connections that either support or challenge what is being presented. And as that process unfolds, something begins to emerge. Not all at once, not in a way that immediately answers every question, but gradually through the alignment of details that start to point in the same direction. And that direction is what gives this moment its weight, because it suggests that the statement is not just information. It is part of a sequence that is becoming clearer with each step. And that clarity is what investigators rely on. Because once a sequence begins to hold together, once it remains consistent across multiple points of analysis, it becomes the foundation for understanding. And that foundation is what allows the case to move forward with purpose. Because now the investigation is no longer searching in all directions, it is focused. It is guided by a structure that has been built through observation, analysis, and connection. And that's where this begins to feel different, because the son-in-law's statement has not just added a new detail, it has introduced a point of alignment, a place where the timeline, the behavior, and the existing evidence begin to intersect in a way that can be followed more clearly than before. And that intersection is what investigators are now exploring more deeply, because it has the potential to reveal how the events of that night actually unfolded, not as isolated moments, but as part of a continuous sequence that connects everything from beginning to end. And as they move through that sequence, as they trace each step and examine each connection, something else becomes clear. The importance of timing, because timing is what determines whether a sequence holds. It shows whether actions occur in a way that makes sense within the context of the case, and when timing aligns with a statement, when the moments described fit within the established framework without contradiction, it strengthens the overall structure. It suggests that what is being presented reflects the reality of what happened rather than an interpretation of it. And that's what makes this stage of the case so critical, because it is where the statement is either reinforced or challenged by the timeline, and that determination is what will shape the next phase of the investigation. Because if the statement holds, if it continues to align with the patterns and the details that have been observed, then it becomes a key piece of the puzzle, something that can guide investigators toward the answers they have been searching for. But if it doesn't, if there are inconsistencies that cannot be reconciled, then those become the focus, the areas where further questions must be asked and deeper analysis must be conducted. And either way, the case moves forward because every detail, whether it aligns or conflicts, contributes to the overall understanding of what happened. And that's what we are seeing now, a movement toward clarity driven by this new development. This moment where silence has been replaced by information, and that information is now being tested against everything that has been established. And as that testing continues, as each part of the statement is examined and each connection is explored, the case begins to take on a form that feels more complete, not in the sense that every answer has been confirmed, but in the sense that the sequence is becoming clearer, more defined, and more capable of being understood in a way that makes sense from beginning to end. And that is what investigators are working toward, not just identifying what happened, but understanding how it happened, how each moment led to the next, and how the entire sequence unfolded in a way that can be explained and confirmed. And as we continue to follow this, as we continue to examine how the son-in-law's statement fits within that sequence, we move closer to that moment, closer to the point where everything begins to align and the answers that have been just out of reach start to come into focus. And when that happens, when the sequence holds and the narrative becomes clear, it will not just change how this case is understood, it will change how it is remembered, because it will show that the key to everything was not in a single moment, but in the way those moments connect, in the pattern that emerges when they are viewed together. And that pattern is what is beginning to reveal itself now, shaped by this statement, guided by the timeline, and moving the case toward a resolution that feels closer than it ever has before. And what comes next may be the detail that finally brings everything together. And when everything is placed side by side, when the statement is no longer just being analyzed on its own, but fully integrated into the timeline, into the behavior, into every connection that has been built throughout the course of this investigation, something begins to settle into place. Not suddenly, not in a way that feels dramatic, but in a way that feels consistent, stable, and increasingly difficult to ignore. Because what we are seeing now is not just information being added, it is a structure being completed, a sequence that once felt fragmented now holding together in a way that allows it to be followed from beginning to end without breaking. And that is what defines a turning point. Not a single moment of revelation, but the gradual alignment of details that, when viewed together, forms something that makes sense across every level of analysis. And that is exactly where this case appears to be heading now, toward that moment where the son-in-law's statement becomes more than just a piece of the puzzle, it becomes part of the framework that explains how everything unfolded. And that framework is what investigators rely on, because once it holds, once it remains consistent under scrutiny, it provides a path forward, a direction that can be followed with confidence rather than uncertainty. And that confidence is what allows the case to move toward resolution, because now the focus is no longer on what could have happened, but on what most likely did happen based on the alignment of the timeline, the behavior, and the details that have been observed. And as that alignment strengthens, as each connection continues to reinforce the next, the case begins to feel less like a mystery made up of disconnected pieces and more like a narrative that can be understood in full, a sequence that explains not just what happened, but how it happened and why it happened the way it did. And that understanding is what brings clarity, because once you can see the sequence, once you can trace each moment from the beginning to the end, the uncertainty that once defined the case begins to fade, replaced by something more grounded, something that holds together no matter how closely it is examined. And that is what investigators are working toward. Not just answers, but answers that make sense within the full context of everything that has been uncovered. And that context is what gives meaning to the statement, because without it, the words exist in isolation, but with it, they become part of something larger, part of a structure that is now being used to guide the final stages of the investigation. And as we stand at this point, as we look at how far the case has come and how much has been revealed through this single moment where silence was broken, it becomes clear that this is not just another update. This is a shift, a movement towards something that feels more complete, more defined, and more capable of leading to the answers that have been just out of reach until now. And that is what makes this moment so important, because it represents the transition from searching to understanding, from questioning to knowing. And that transition is what brings closure, not just to the investigation, but to the story itself. Because once the truth is understood, once the sequence is complete, there is nothing left to piece together, only to acknowledge what has been revealed and to follow where it leads next. And that is the moment we are approaching now, the moment where everything finally aligns, where the case reaches a level of clarity it has never had before, and where the answers that have been hidden within the details begin to emerge in a way that cannot be ignored. And if you have followed this case, if you have stayed with the details and the patterns as they began to form, then you already know how significant this is, because this is where everything changes. This is where the story moves from uncertainty into understanding. And this is where the truth begins to take its final shape. And if you want to be there when that happens, if you want to follow this case all the way to its conclusion and see how every piece fits together, make sure you stay right here, because this is where we uncover the details that matter. This is where we connect the pieces others overlook. And this is where the truth, no matter how hidden it may seem, is brought into the light. And if there is one thing this case has shown us, it is that even the longest silence can eventually lead to the most important answers. And what comes next may be the moment that confirms everything.